The alarm on her phone buzzed at 5:30 a.m., a tiny, insistent sound in the darkness of her small apartment. She reached out from under the thin blanket, fumbling to silence it. Outside her window, the city was still asleep, but for her, the day had already begun. This was the quietest part of her day, a few stolen moments before the world rushed in. She'd sit by the window with a cup of instant coffee, watching the sky slowly change from deep blue to a soft, dusty gray, and think about the bills spread across her small kitchen table. Rent, electricity, the phone bill, a payment for a student loan for a dream she had put on hold a long time ago. Each one was a brick in a wall, she felt. She was constantly pushing against. Her uniform for the restaurant was a simple black dress and a crisp white apron. She'd bought the dress secondhand, and she was careful to iron it every morning. Even though the wrinkles seemed to reappear the moment she put it on, it was a uniform of invisibility. A costume that allowed her to move through the world of the wealthy without really being seen. She was a shadow, a pair of hands that filled water glasses and cleared plates. Her name was Clara, but most people just called her Miss. The restaurant was called The Gilded Spoon, a name that always sounded a little silly to her. It was a place of high ceilings, soft lighting, and tables draped in white linen. The air always smelled of expensive perfume, fresh bread, and the faint metallic scent of money. Clara moved through the dining room like a ghost, her feet making no sound on the thick carpet. She carried heavy trays balanced on her shoulder, her movements practiced and smooth. She learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to place a fork down just as a hand reached for it, to refill a glass before it was empty. It was a skill she had honed out of necessity. In the far corner of the main dining room, tucked away almost as if it were an afterthought, stood a baby grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument with a polished black wood finish that gleamed under the soft lights, but it was always silent. It was a prop, a piece of decoration to add to the restaurant's old-world charm. Dust would settle on its lid, and the keys would look yellowed and sad. Clara was always the one who cleaned it. In the quiet hours before the restaurant opened, or in the lull after the lunch rush, she would take a soft cloth and wipe it down. She would be gentle, almost reverent. Sometimes, when no one was around, she would let her fingers rest on the cool ivory keys. She wouldn't press them down, not hard enough to make a sound. She would just feel them under her fingertips, a silent conversation with a part of herself she kept locked away. She remembered the weight of these keys, the way they would respond to the slightest touch, the way a whole world of sound could come alive under her hands. But that was another life. A life of music lessons and scholarship applications, and a future that had shimmered with possibility. Now, her future was about tips and rent and making it through another day. This particular evening was busier than most. A large party had been booked for a table in her section, a group of young people who were clearly used to getting whatever they wanted. They were loud, their laughter echoing off the walls, and they acted as if the restaurant was their own private playground. Clara steeled herself with a deep breath before approaching their table. The young man at the head of the table, the one who seemed to be the leader, had a smirk permanently fixed on his face. He wore a designer watch that probably cost more than Clara made in 6 months. He didn't look at her when he spoke. He looked through her. "We'll need another bottle of the Chateau Lafite," he said, not bothering to look at the wine list. "And make it quick? We're celebrating." His friends laughed, a chorus of privileged amusement. Clara nodded, her face a mask of polite professionalism. She had learned that showing any emotion, any sign of annoyance or frustration, was a mistake. It was an invitation for more trouble. As the evening went on, the group became more demanding. They snapped their fingers to get her attention. They complained about the food, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because they could. One of them knocked over a glass of red wine, and Clara had to rush to clean it up, her hands trembling slightly as she dabbed at the deep red stain on the white tablecloth. The young man watched her, his eyes narrowed. He didn't like her. He didn't like her quiet dignity, the way she refused to be flustered, the way she met his gaze for a brief moment before looking away, not in submission but in a calm, steady way that he found unsettling. He was used to people cowering before him, And she the idea in single quotes Clara could feel his eyes on her as she moved around the table, clearing the main course plates. She was a knot of tension inside, but on the outside she was the picture of calm. She thought about the piano in the corner. She thought about the music she used to play, the powerful, passionate pieces that allowed her to express all the emotions she had to keep buried inside. She imagined playing a loud, dramatic chord that would make everyone in the room stop and look. It was a fleeting, satisfying thought, a small rebellion in her own mind. The young man leaned back in his chair, a cruel glint in his eye. He had been watching her all night, and he had decided he didn't like the way she carried herself, the quiet pride that seemed to radiate from her even in her simple uniform. He wanted to see her break, to see that calm exterior crumble. He wanted to remind her of her place. His eyes scanned the room, looking for a way to do it, and they landed on the dusty piano in the corner. A slow, malicious smile spread across his face. He had found his weapon. He leaned forward, tapping his knife against his water glass to get her attention. The sharp, ringing cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. Clara turned to him, her expression neutral, ready for another condescending demand. But what he had in store for her was something she could never have imagined. The sharp, ringing sound of the knife tapping against the water glass cut through the low hum of the restaurant like a siren. Every head in the vicinity turned. For Clara, the sound was a physical blow, making her flinch. She had just finished clearing the last of the dinner plates from the large table, her arms aching from the weight of the heavy porcelain. She turned slowly, her professional smile already fixed on her face, a mask she had worn for so long it felt like a second skin. The young man at the head of the table was looking directly at her, a smirk playing on his lips. He had lowered the knife but kept his eyes locked on hers. "My dear," he began, his voice loud enough to carry to the tables nearby. He had a way of speaking that was both charming and dismissive, as if he were talking to a child. "We've been so thoroughly entertained this evening." The food was acceptable. His friends chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "But we feel the night is missing something. A certain artistic flair." He leaned back in his chair, making a show of thinking, his fingers steepled under his chin. His gaze drifted past her, landing on the dark, silent shape in the corner of the room. The piano. A cold dread began to creep up Clara's spine. "Yes," he continued, his eyes lighting up as if he just had a brilliant original idea. "That's it. Some music." He turned his attention back to her, his smile widening. "I will make you an offer. A very generous offer." He pulled a thick wallet from the inside pocket of his expensive jacket and placed it on the table with a soft thud. "I will leave a $500 tip on this table. Right here. Right now. All you have to do is grace us with one song." "Just one?" The air around Clara seemed to thicken, to grow heavy and hard to breathe. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on her now. The quiet conversations had stopped. The clinking of silverware had ceased. It was as if someone had pressed a mute button on the whole world, leaving only the sound of her own heart, which was now hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. A $500 tip. The number echoed in her head. It was more than she made in a week. It was rent money. It was a way to breathe, just for a little while. But she knew. She knew with every fiber of her being that this was not a gift. It was a trap. His friends were no longer just chuckling. They were openly laughing, leaning into each other and whispering. They looked at her with a mixture of pity and cruel anticipation. They saw her uniform, her tired eyes, the way she stood with her hands clasped in front of her, a picture of servitude. To them, she was just a waitress, a girl from a world where concertos were not played, where dreams were a luxury you couldn't afford. The expectation was clear. They wanted her to stammer an excuse. They wanted her to get flustered and embarrassed. Or even better, they wanted her to accept, to walk over to that dusty piano, and to plunk out a few discordant, humiliating notes. It was a game to them, and her dignity was the prize. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. She saw the manager, Mr. Henderson, standing by the entrance to the kitchen. His face was pale, his hands nervously wringing a small towel. He was caught. He couldn't anger his best customers, the ones who ordered the most expensive wine and didn't blink at the bill. But he also couldn't, in good conscience, throw his employee to the wolves. He gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a look of helpless apology in his eyes. There was no help coming. She was on her own. The young man was enjoying this. He loved the power he held in this moment, the way he could control the room, control her, with just a few words and the promise of money. He slowly peeled off 5 $100 bills and placed them on the table, fanning them out with a theatrical flourish. "The offer is on the table," he said, his voice a low, triumphant purr. "What do you say?" Clara's mind was racing. She thought about saying no. She could invent an excuse. "I'm sorry, I don't play." But it would be a lie, and they would probably see right through it. Besides, refusing a direct request from a customer, especially one offering such a large sum, could be grounds for dismissal. She needed this job. She needed it more than she needed her pride, didn't she? The thought was a bitter pill. She thought about just sitting down and banging on the keys, giving them the awful performance they craved. But the thought of it, of intentionally making a fool of herself, of mocking the one thing in the world that had ever been truly hers, felt like a betrayal of herself. Her gaze fell upon the piano. It looked so lonely sitting there in the corner, a forgotten king on a dethroned throne. She remembered the feeling of the keys under her fingers, the way the music would flow out of her, a river of sound that could wash away all the dirt and grime of the world. She hadn't played in years. Not since the pressure had become too much, not since the joy had curdled into anxiety. The last time she had played for an audience had been at her final scholarship audition. She had been so nervous, her hands so sweaty, that she had fumbled a passage in a piece she knew by heart. The judges' faces had been blank, unreadable. She had walked out of that room and never looked back. She had packed her dreams away in a box and locked it tight. Now, that box was being forced open. The young man was watching her, his patience starting to wear thin. The smirk was still there, but there was an edge to it now. "Well? We don't have all night." The silence in the room had become a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. She could feel the sweat beading on her upper lip, her hands growing cold and clammy. There was no way out. She was a mouse in a corner, and the cat was toying with her. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was the smallest of movements, but it was like a starting pistol had gone off. The young man's face broke into a triumphant grin. His friends erupted in a fresh round of snickers. Mr. Henderson closed his eyes, as if he couldn't bear to watch. Clara felt a strange sense of calm descend over her, a quiet stillness in the middle of the storm. It was the calm of surrender. She had lost. Now, all she had to do was go and collect her punishment. She turned and began the long walk toward the instrument of her intended shame. The distance between her table and the piano had never seemed so vast. Each step felt heavy, as if she were walking through wet cement. She could feel the eyes of every single person in the dining room on her back. Some were pitying, some were cruel, and some were just curious, enjoying the free show. She kept her gaze fixed on the piano, focusing on the polished black wood and the yellowed keys. She tried to empty her mind, to think of nothing, to feel nothing, but she couldn't stop the memories from flooding back. The hours of practice, the calluses on her fingers, the thrill of a perfect chord, the crushing disappointment of a wrong note. It was all there, waiting for her. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, her hand resting on the smooth, cool wood. The dust was gone now. She had wiped it clean just that afternoon. She could see her faint reflection in the glossy surface, a distorted, ghostly image of a girl in a black and white uniform. She slowly pulled out the heavy bench and sat down, the wood cool against her legs. She adjusted her position, her body remembering the posture from a million lessons ago. Straight back, shoulders relaxed, feet flat on the floor. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. The room was utterly silent. The air was thick with expectation. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and fast. This was it. The moment of humiliation. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the first awful sound. She sat on the polished bench, the silence of the room pressing down on her like a physical weight. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from the threads of 100 stairs. She could feel the young man's gaze on her back, a hot, pointy thing filled with smug satisfaction. He was waiting for the crash, the discordant thud of failure. Her hands hovered over the yellowed keys, not an inch above them, but it felt like a mile. They were trembling, a fine, uncontrollable shudder that started in her wrists and ran all the way up her arms. She felt a cold sweat on her forehead, and her breath was shallow and quick, catching in her throat. For a moment she considered just striking a single, loud, terrible chord and getting it over with. A screech of noise that would fulfill their prophecy, give them their laugh, and allow her to slink back into the shadows. It would be a small price to pay for the end of this awful moment, but then her fingers made contact. They didn't strike. They rested. It was a gentle, almost accidental touch, as if they were drawn to the keys by a memory they couldn't quite place. She felt the cool, smooth ivory beneath her fingertips, familiar and strange at the same time. She pressed one key, not with force, but with a quiet, hesitant curiosity. A single, perfect note rang out, clear and pure, slicing through the thick tension in the air like a sharp knife through warm butter. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place in the hostile silence, that it seemed to hang in the air, shimmering. The snickering from the young man's table stopped abruptly. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. The single note was not a mistake. It was not a joke. It was correct. Beautiful, even in its simplicity, and in that moment something inside her shifted. The sound of that one note was a key turning in a lock she had long forgotten. It opened a door to a room inside her that she had kept sealed for years, a room filled with passion and fury and a love so fierce it had scared her. She closed her eyes, shutting out the room, the faces, the judgment, the cruel smirk she could feel burning into her skin. She was no longer a waitress in a fancy restaurant, a pawn in a rich boy's cruel game. She was back in her old teacher's small, sunlit studio, a teenager with callous fingers and a dream so big it barely fit inside her chest. Taking a deep, steadying breath, her fingers began to move. They didn't fumble or hesitate. They knew exactly where to go. A cascade of intricate, powerful notes filled the era Chopin etude she had practiced 1,000 times, a piece that was both a technical challenge and an emotional outpouring. The music was not just technically brilliant. It was filled with a raw, unspoken truth. It spoke of long nights and lonely days, of the ache of wanting something you can't have. It spoke of a fire that had been banked but never extinguished, a spirit that had been bowed but never broken. Her body, which had been stiff with fear, began to relax. Her back straightened. Her trembling hands became sure and strong, dancing across the keys with a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere else, from a deeper, older part of herself. She was no longer thinking about the notes or the people watching or the $500 on the table. The music was playing her. It was a river that had been dammed for too long, and now it was bursting through, carving its own path, powerful and unstoppable. The restaurant was transformed. The clatter of the kitchen from the swinging doors had ceased. The hushed, important conversations had died completely. Faces that had been mocking or indifferent were now masks of sheer astonishment. A woman in a silk dress, who had been looking at her with pity, now had her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with wonder. The bartender, who had been polishing a glass with a bored expression, had stopped moving entirely, his head cocked to one side, listening across the room. The young man was a portrait of pure, unadulterated shock. His triumphant smirk had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. He had expected a spectacle of failure, a moment of public shaming he could savor. He had not expected this. He had not expected beauty. He had not expected to be forgotten, rendered completely insignificant by a wave of sound so powerful it seemed to erase everything else in its path. His scheme had not just failed. It had detonated in his face, elevating his target far, far above his own small, petty world. He looked at the girl at the piano, the girl he had seen as a simple, faceless waitress, and he didn't recognize her. She was a stranger, filled with a power he couldn't understand and a grace he could never possess. The music swelled, rising and falling like a tide. It was angry and sad, then joyful and free. It was the story of her life, told in a language everyone in the room could understand, even if they had never heard a piece of classical music before. It was the sound of a soul finally being allowed to breathe. She played with an intensity that was both exhilarating and a little frightening. It was as if she was pouring every ounce of her suppressed energy, every unshed tear, every silent scream into the piano. The instrument, which had been a silent, dusty prop for so long, was now alive, vibrating with the force of her emotion, its voice filling every corner of the room. As the piece neared its end, the tempo quickened, the notes becoming a flurry of motion, a storm of sound that was both chaotic and perfectly controlled. It was a final, desperate burst of expression before the quiet returned. Then, with a series of powerful, resonant chords, the music came to an end. The final, thundering chord faded into a profound, echoing silence that lasted for what felt like an eternity. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, held in the grip of the silence that followed the storm. It was a sacred moment, a shared experience that had touched everyone in the room. The young woman at the piano, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath, slowly opened her eyes as if waking from a long, vivid dream. The reality of the moment, of what she had just done, came crashing down on her. The final, thundering chord faded into a profound, echoing silence that lasted for what felt like an eternity. It was not an empty silence, but a full one, heavy with the memory of the music that had just filled the room. The notes seemed to hang in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam, invisible but present. No one moved. No one spoke. The bartender, who had been frozen mid-polish, slowly lowered the glass he was holding, his eyes still wide. The woman in the silk dress slowly lowered the hand that had been covering her mouth, her expression one of pure awe. In that shared, sacred quiet, the young woman at the piano, whose name they still did not know, was no longer a waitress. She was the creator of the moment they were all living in. For Clara, the silence was a sudden, cold shock. The dreamlike state where the music had played her was gone. She was back in her body, sitting on a hard wooden bench in a restaurant. Her fingers felt stiff and sore, a dull ache starting in her wrists. Her heart was still beating fast, a frantic drum against her ribs. She slowly opened her eyes, blinking as if waking from a long, vivid dream. The reality of the moment, of what she had just done, came crashing down on her. She had not just played the piano. She had poured her entire soul out for a room full of strangers, for the boy who tried to humiliate her, for herself. A wave of vulnerability washed over her so strong it made her feel dizzy. She felt exposed, raw, as if she had taken off her skin and left it on the keys for everyone to see. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to become the invisible waitress again. She looked down at her hands, still resting on the keys, as if they belonged to someone else. Then a single sound broke the spell. It was the slow, deliberate clap of an old man sitting near the back, a music professor who dined there every Tuesday. It was a sound of respect, not entertainment. Another person joined in, then another. The sound grew, slowly at first, then gathering speed and volume until it was no longer just clapping, but a wave of genuine, thunderous applause that started at the back of the room and swept forward. It wasn't polite, restrained clapping. It was an eruption of pure emotion. People were on their feet. The woman in the silk dress was dabbing her eyes with a napkin, a bright smile on her face through her tears. The couple in the corner, who had been having a tense, whispered argument before the music started, were now holding hands. Their faces turned toward the piano with soft expressions. Clara flinched at the sound, her shoulders hunching forward as if to protect herself from the force of it. She was not a performer accustomed to standing ovations. She was a girl who served food. This attention was overwhelming, a bright, hot light she didn't know how to face. She didn't stand up to take a bow. She just sat there, her head bowed, her hands finally pulling away from the keys and folding into her lap. The applause was for the music, for the girl who played it, but in her mind, it was a storm she had to weather. Across the room, the young man was a portrait of pure, unadulterated humiliation. His triumphant smirk had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief that slowly curdled into a blotchy, angry red. His scheme had not just failed. It had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. He had tried to make her small, and in doing so had made her a giant. He had tried to expose her as a fraud, and had instead revealed her as a prodigy. He looked around at his friends, but they were not looking at him. They were staring at the piano, their expressions a mixture of shock and, to his horror, grudging respect. He was alone in his defeat. The power he had felt just minutes ago had evaporated, leaving behind a bitter, hollow feeling. With a sudden, jerky movement, he grabbed his wallet from the table. He didn't count the money. He just threw a thick wad of cash onto the table, far more than the $500 he had promised. The bills scattered across the white tablecloth like fallen leaves. It was a petulant, impotent act, a final attempt to assert his importance through money. Then, without a word to his friends, he turned and stormed toward the exit, his walk stiff with rage. His friends, caught off guard, looked at each other for a moment before scrambling to gather their things and follow him out, whispering amongst themselves as the young man's group fled the scene. The restaurant manager, Mr. Henderson, finally began to move. He had been standing by the kitchen doors, his face a mask of shock, his hands nervously wringing a small towel. Now he walked toward Clara, his steps hesitant at first, then more purposeful. The applause was beginning to subside, but people were still on their feet. Their faces warm with appreciation. Mr. Henderson approached the piano not with the nervous energy of a man worried about a customer complaint, but with the quiet reverence of someone who had just witnessed a miracle. He stopped beside the bench, clearing his throat softly. I had no idea," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That was truly special." He looked at her, not as an employee, but as a person, a flicker of genuine admiration in his eyes. Other patrons began to approach the piano, not in a crowd, but one by one. An elderly woman, her eyes still shining, came up to her. "Young lady," she said, her voice gentle, "thank you. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Then came the old music professor. He didn't say much, just leaned in and whispered, "You have a gift. A rare and precious gift. Don't ever let the world or anyone in it convince you to keep it locked away again." His words were not just a compliment. They were a benediction, a permission slip to be the person she had just revealed herself to be. Clara looked from one kind face to another, her mind struggling to process the shift in the atmosphere. Just an hour ago, these same people had seen her as part of the furniture, a silent servant. Now they looked at her with warmth and respect. The uniform she wore, the symbol of her invisibility, suddenly felt different. It was still just a simple black dress, but it no longer felt like a cage. She had been seen, truly seen, and the world had not ended. In fact, in a strange and wonderful way, it felt like it had just begun. The knot of anxiety that had been a permanent resident in her stomach had loosened its grip, replaced by a fragile, fluttering feeling of hope. She was still a waitress with bills to pay, but she was also something more. She was a musician. And for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A week later, the alarm on her phone still buzzed at 5:30 a.m. The small apartment was still dark, the city outside still asleep. But something was different. The quietness no longer felt empty. It felt full of possibility. She still sat by the window with her cup of instant coffee, watching the sky change color, but her thoughts were no longer just a list of worries. The bills were still there, spread across the kitchen table, a stark reminder of reality, but they no longer seemed like an insurmountable wall. They were just things to be dealt with. A new thought had taken up residence in her mind, a fragile but persistent melody that played on a loop. It was the memory of the piano keys under her fingers, the sound of applause, the feeling of being truly seen. When she arrived at the Gilded Spoon for her shift that evening, the air felt different. It was the same restaurant with the same high ceilings and soft lighting, but the energy had shifted. As she walked through the kitchen, the head chef, a gruff man who usually just grunted at her, looked up and gave her a small, respectful nod. One of the other waitresses, a girl who had always been a bit competitive, caught her eye and gave her a genuine smile. "Heard you had quite a night the other week," she said, her voice friendly. "We all did. It was amazing." Clara felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but it wasn't a blush of shame. It was a blush of quiet pride. The biggest change was in the corner of the room. The dusty, forgotten piano was gone. In its place stood the same instrument, but it had been transformed. It was polished to a high gleam, the black wood reflecting the soft lights like a mirror. The yellowed keys were now a clean, bright ivory. A small, elegant vase with a single white rose sat on top. It was no longer a prop. It was a centerpiece, a statement. The restaurant had claimed her music as its own. During her shift, patrons who had been there on that special night recognized her. They didn't stare or point. They just offered warm, knowing smiles as she refilled their water glasses or cleared their plates. An elderly gentleman who had been sitting near the back that night beckoned her over. "Young lady," he said, his voice kind, "I hope you know you brought a lot of joy to this room. We haven't stopped talking about it." She felt a warmth spread through her chest. She was still a waitress, still moving through the room with a tray in her hand, but she was no longer a ghost. She had a story now, and people knew it. Near the end of her shift, Mr. Henderson, the manager, approached her. "Could I see you in my office for a moment?" he asked. Her old anxiety flared up for a second, a familiar reflex. Was she in trouble? But his expression was not angry or nervous. It was calm and businesslike, with a hint of something else. Excitement? His small office was tucked away behind the kitchen. It was cluttered with invoices and schedules. He offered her a seat, then sat down behind his desk, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "I'll get straight to the point," he began. "What happened last week? It was incredible, truly. I've had more phone calls and emails about that than about any new menu or wine special we've ever had." He shuffled some papers on his desk. "People are asking when you're playing again." Clara just sat there, not sure what to say. "It was just a one-time thing," she finally managed to say. "I don't think it can be," Mr. Henderson said, a smile touching his lips. "I've been thinking. This restaurant, it's a nice place, but it's missing something, a soul, and I think you might be it." He took a deep breath. "I want to offer you a new position. I want you to be our house pianist, Friday and Saturday nights. We'll get you a new uniform, something more elegant. We'll pay you a proper salary, plus a percentage of the bar sales on those nights. What do you say?" Clara felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. A salary, a real salary? Not just the unpredictable hustle of tips. The chance to play music, not as a challenge or a fluke, but as her job. It was everything she had ever wanted and everything she had been terrified of, all wrapped up in one offer. The fear came rushing back. The memory of her failed audition, the sweaty palms, the fumbled notes, the feeling of being a fraud. What if she couldn't do it again? What if that one night was just a flash of lightning, something that could never be replicated? What if the pressure of a real performance, of being expected to be good, would crush her? She must have looked terrified, because Mr. Henderson's expression softened. "Look," he said, his voice gentler now. "I know this is a big change. You don't have to decide right now. Think about it. But I have a good feeling about this. I think you do too." She walked home that night in a daze. The city lights blurred through her unshed tears. She went straight to the small closet in her apartment and pulled out a dusty cardboard box from the back. Inside were her old sheet music, the pages yellowed and soft with age. She ran her fingers over the titles, Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Beethoven. She saw the pencil marks her old teacher had made, the little notes of encouragement written in the margins. She remembered the girl she used to be, a girl who lived and breathed music, who believed with all her heart that this was her destiny. She had locked that girl away, thinking she was protecting her. But she had just been suffocating her. She thought about the feeling of playing that night, the way the music had flowed through her, the connection she had felt with the strangers in the room. She thought about the old professor's words. Don't ever let the world convince you to keep it locked away again. The fear was still there, a small cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time, it was outweighed by something else, a flicker of hope, a spark of courage. She couldn't go back to being the invisible waitress. She had to try. The following Saturday, the restaurant was buzzing. It was busier than it had ever been. But Clara wasn't carrying a tray. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress, the kind she had always admired on the patrons but could never afford. She had done her hair, and for the first time in a long time, she felt beautiful. She walked through the dining room, not toward the kitchen, but toward the piano in the corner. The walk was different. It wasn't a walk of shame. It was a walk of purpose. Every step was a declaration. Heads turned, and people smiled at her, their faces filled with warm anticipation. She sat down at the polished piano, the cool ivory of the keys feeling like an old friend. She looked out at the audience, at the faces turned toward her, waiting. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs not with panic, but with a calm, steady strength. She thought of the girl who was set up to be humiliated, and she sent her a silent thank you. Without that night, this moment would not exist. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The music that filled the room was not the raw, emotional storm of that first night. It was different. It was more nuanced, more controlled, more joyful. It was the music of someone who had found their place in the world. It was a conversation, a story, a gift. And as she played, lost in the world of sound she had created, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was finally home. The future was no longer a thing to be feared, but a song waiting to be composed, and she was the one holding the pen.